Okay, I think we will begin. I think we have most people with us. Welcome to what is the first Friends Talk of 2021. I hope everyone can hear me. I know I did get one suggestion that it was a bit low, but I hope everyone can hear me. And I would like to introduce Dr. Roger Stalley, who's a fellow emeritus of Trinity College and formerly professor of history of art and a medieval specialist. His writing and research has embraced both Irish and European art and architecture. Roger has published 8 books, and his latest one, Early Irish Sculpture and Art of the High Crosses, was published in May 2020, and I'm sure he will tell us all about that. Not only that, but Roger is also currently a trustee of Chester BT. So I'm delighted to have him here to talk to us today about the Irish High Crosses, and I will let him take over for now. As usual, the questions and answers box is down the bottom. If you come up with any questions throughout the talk, just pop them in the bottom and I will call them out at the end and we'll get through them that way. Okay, thanks Emil and enjoy.
Thanks so much, Sive. It's great to be with everybody. Just a pity, of course, that we're not meeting in the Chester Beat itself, but given the weather outside, it's maybe a good thing that we're not. And not traveling out and about. Anyway, as Steve explained, I want to talk today about Irish sculpture and the high crosses, but in fact, I have to confess my title is a bit misleading because I'm really only going to talk about one sculptor. A sculptor I think was kind of quite fantastic at the time. I mean, we're talking about 1,000 years ago, well, 1100 actually, and at the time he worked in Ireland, there was really nobody to compare with him anywhere else in Europe. So he's not only exceptional in Ireland, but he's also really very exceptional across Europe at the time. So I'm going to go straight away and just look at 1 or 2 examples of his work to try and convince you that, well, particularly of his qualities. And I'm taking a panel here from one of the great crosses at Clonmacnoise. And I'd just like you to look at it quite carefully. You'll see we've got a figure seated. He's on a throne with a kind of curved seat. There's a curious bird up beside his shoulder. But the key thing is he's holding a staff or rod in his hand, which he's punching very firmly down into some poor unfortunate down below. In fact, he's hit him with such velocity that the little fellow below his legs have shot up to the right. It's a very intriguing composition, quite puzzling. I think almost certainly it must have something to do with the really overcoming the damned or those who didn't believe. It must be some sort of saint, we imagine, perhaps an Irish monk in action. But I want particularly you to look at the way it's carved. It's not a very big panel. It's only about, I suppose, about a foot and a half high, but it's carved in relief. In other words, the sculptor with his chisel only went back in, I suppose it's about 6 or 7 centimeters. But despite the thinness of the relief, look at the head and the way the head almost seems to project out of the background of the stone. And it's very cleverly done in that regard. He's also very adept, and you will see this in more examples later on, at sort of getting a lot of excitement and movement into the whole composition. As I say, you can almost feel the impact of that staff. And his figures for Ireland are really quite remarkably natural and naturalistic. We tend to think of Irish art in fairly sort of abstract terms. You think of those figures in the Book of Kells, which are very kind of flat and two-dimensional, whereas this fellow, his human proportions are fairly convincing, and he's frequently, he gives his figures very rounded forms. Look at the legs, for example, of the fellow at the bottom as they fly upwards. But another feature of his work, which is very consistent, is he loves little details, you know, very specific details, almost one might say, from the world around him. And if you look closely, the monk, if that's who it is, has got a sort of band around his neck. But the thing I really wanted to point out was down below the figure with his upturned legs. He's wearing extraordinary trousers, sort of, I don't know, a bit reminiscent of old hot pants or something like that, very tight. Somebody suggested they're underpants, but they didn't have underpants in the Middle Ages. So it's not quite clear who he is and what he's wearing. But if we just think about the subject for a moment, I have an arrow there and you can see the great cross. It's on the side. It's not perhaps terribly conspicuous, but almost certainly it has something to do with the Last Judgment, the final division of the saved and the damned. And this is very much on the damned sides, hence my thinking that this is actually the conquest, you might say, of unbelief, the triumph of Christianity. Now, Clement Noyes, of course, is not the only place this sculptor worked. He worked at Monaster Boyce on two great crosses there, of which you see a panel again from one of them, the Great Cross of Muirdac, which I'm sure many of you have seen. This panel, it's often thought to be the arrest of Christ, and that at first sight is what it looks like, because you can see Christ in the center holding a staff, and then you can see two soldiers either side walking towards him with their swords. But in fact, that's not actually the case. This is showing a scene just after that, during the trial of Christ, when he was proclaimed and shown to the people as King of the Jews. He was mocked, in other words. It's the mocking of Christ, and proclaimed as a king. Now, this is very significant because if you look closely, very closely at the central figure, just there on the chest, you'll see a brooch, a circular brooch. And that, of course, is just like the famous penannular brooch, the ring brooches, of which there's such a fabulous collection in the National Museum. And of course, it's there. The sculptors put it in quite deliberately because Christ was shown to the people with a great robe, a great purple robe. And you can see he's gone out of his way to decorate that a little, and complete with the brooch, which in Irish terms, of course, would be a mark of, well, certainly the aristocratic elite, if not kingship. Now, you see many of the same features I mentioned earlier. The figures are on the move, the soldiers are on the move, they're walking, there's plenty of action. And Christ incidentally is holding a staff because he was given by the soldiers a reed to put in his hand, a kind of as a mock scepter, so to speak. But as I said, there's plenty of action, and you can see the two soldiers have got moustaches, but immediately I would stress to you the sense of relief. You feel that they're kind of projecting well out from the stone, but I would also stress too the kind of general naturalism, the ease with which they move, and the roundedness of their bodies. But the point I really wanted to mention, and this kind of makes you want to go snap with Clement Noyes, because you see the trousers that particularly the two soldiers are wearing, these short, very strange sort of pants that they have, which you don't really find in other sculpture elsewhere in Ireland, or anywhere else for that matter, at the time. So here we're having a very, I would say, very confident and talented sculptor, and he's working in Ireland around about the years 900, 920. Now, of course, there's, as it were, nothing new. People have been looking at these wonderful carvings for 200 or 300 years, and they've been much admired, rightly, both as great archaeological monuments, but also as historical monuments. But the thing which I think has tended to be overlooked is the artistic skill of the individual, and the fact that he really is very exceptional for his time. Now, why has he been ignored? Why? Well, I suppose the principal reason is that we don't know his name. And it's a fact that in art history, where you've got artists without a name, somehow it's hard to get engaged in them. We like to know a little bit about their careers and their characters. And, you know, if you really know nothing about a sculptor, and they're just anonymous individuals, it all seems a little bit kind of disappointing and tedious. So I decided if he doesn't have a name, I'll give him a name. So I've called him the Muirdat Master. And the reason for that is quite simply that the great cross, the detail of which you see there on the left from Monaster Boyce, has the name Muirdat on it at the bottom. You can just see the M between the two cats there at the base. And Muirdat was the abbot who commissioned the carvings. So Muirdat Master seemed to be the most appropriate way of describing the artist. Now, once you've got a name, you know, you can begin to think, well, how many other carvings did he do? And which order did he make them in? And, you know, what makes him different from other sculptors of the day? Somehow it's much easier to imagine him as a real human being rather than just, as it were, I don't know, an archaeological or artistic object. I'm going to stay with the Monaster Boyce. There is Muirdat's cross in its full glory. You can see the panel we've been looking at there near the base, and the other panels, the crucifixion, of course, up at the top. And the formula which is usually adopted for these crosses is to have a crucifixion, which you can see there on one side, and the Last Judgment on the other. But almost invariably, you do get a panel showing, as we're going to see here, that's just a detail or an angle photograph just to bring out the dense sense of relief that you get here in that particular panel. But the subject you, again, almost always have, or not quite always, but very frequently have, is the fall of man, Adam and Eve in the garden. And you've got this here at Monaster Boyce in a very clearly stated way. On the left there, you see the tree of life in the center. You see the leaves and the fruit falling down either side, brilliantly making a sort of frame or arch for Eve on the left, offering the apple to Adam, who's on the right. And you'll notice the face, I'm afraid the faces you can see are badly damaged, but the head of Adam, he has this sort of bearded face, and it's at a 3/4 view. That's something which we will continually find in this artist's works. And you've got the movement, they're walking along, actually walking almost precariously, you might say, along the very base or the frame of the picture. But as I say, there's plenty of movement. And you see, once again, these very full kind of fleshy bodies, very wholesome thighs somehow there. It's quite unlike equivalent sculptures of Adam and Eve at this time in other Irish sculpture. They are actually, when you think about it, I mean, I mentioned, you know, these have been in the open air for 1,100 years. So while, you know, we're sorry to see that a lot of the detail has gone, on the other hand, it's amazing how well they have survived outdoors. That has a lot to do with the quality of the stone in which they're carved. It's a very fine, hard, quartzy sandstone. I'll say a little bit more about that later on. But back to my sculptor and his individuality, you might say, how can I be so sure that he's doing a series of sculptures at different places, sorry. Well, the simplest way we can do that is just to compare with other areas, other sculpture in Ireland in particular. I'm sure many of you know the carvings at Moon. Everybody remembers the carvings there at Castle Dermot and Moon, made of granite, a very different material, and maybe that made life more difficult for the sculptor. But we all remember it, of course, because of those extraordinary square bodies, the little figures giving their square bodies with their feet just popping out below. You know, inevitably, all my students, they always call them, of course, all the Mr. Men carvings, and you can see why. But what a gap exists between the Muirdat Master with this very naturalizing style and the little figures that you see, almost diagrammatic figures that you see there at Moon. But then here is another cross, not by the Muirdat Master. This is at Kells, and with the same subject, Adam and Eve, as you can see there. And well, I hate to say it, but I don't think this sculptor is in the same league as my man. his figures are rather poorly proportioned. The heads are enormous, actually, and they're certainly not very firm on their feet. So I hope you begin to see the quality of the sculptor I'm talking about compared to some of his contemporaries. And here is another example. This comes from across Donnermore in County Tyrone, a quite well preserved cross actually, but you can see the sandstone here is more badly worn, but you can see that the figures themselves are, very emaciated, alas, but they're rigid nonetheless in terms of, no sense really of movement at all to them. So it's from comparisons like that that you begin to build up a kind of picture of this individual. And, one wonders, well, where did he come from? Was he Irish? Was he a local man? There have been suggestions that, God forbid, he might have been a foreigner brought in from abroad, even a suggestion from France. What other works had he seen? What was he, what was inspiring him on this sort of work? And as I said, in what order? We've got quite a number of works by him. In what order did he carve them? And perhaps more to the point, who's actually paying for them? Who's commissioning these works? Well, I think if we pursue his work a little bit further, before I get into those issues, I just want to make one further and really important point. We can quite clearly see that behind his work, there are lots of themes and ideas which have been in existence for a good while. Many of them go back to the earliest days of Christianity. But what makes him very special is that he doesn't just repeat. It's full of ingenious adaptation. He takes an idea somehow and it's varied and adapted to this particular context on the crosses. And one lovely idea is the blessing hand. Now, what we're looking at there on the screen is, can you see, we're looking at the underside of the arm of the cross. So if you go, it's on the north side of Muridat's cross. So if you go around, you have to crane your neck and look up. And what you see is the hand there in a lovely sort of decorated circle. And then down below, 3 heads, quite cheerful, chubby looking heads, faces, and the favorite head style, if I could put it that way, of this sculptor. Do you see this suggestion of little curls right around, or a hairstyle with little curls right around the forehead there, very characteristic. And for good measure, they're given a frame, but the frame is made up of 2 snakes which overlap each other. And we've got one head at the bottom and another head at the top. Now, there's been a lot of discussion as to what that hand might be. And I know from the years in which I took students, and we all used to modest boys, they all used to discuss, well, it should be the right hand of God. And if he's blessing us standing below, it's the wrong way around, because it would be, as it were, his left hand. And so there's been lots of discussion and argument about, is a blessing hand, or is he holding up the cross? Indeed. But I think there's not much doubt that the idea comes from much, much earlier, because in Christian art, way back into the 4th, 5th century, you get the idea of God's presence. God's presence is indicated just by a hand emerging from the sky, emerging from the cosmos, as you see it in these 2 examples of mosaics from Italy. And that's the ultimate source of the idea, though, of course, as a theme, the blessing hand was quite common, actually, in early medieval art. But it's found, actually, just to show you, this is a bit far-fetched, perhaps, but here in Ravenna, beautiful mosaic, those fantastic mosaics in San Vitale. But you see, you've got this idea of framing saints, putting saints in a little sort of nice decorative circle. And here you can see in green, these are sort of green dolphins acting as a frame. And you can imagine that maybe our sculptor has seen something like this. And of course, instead of dolphins, he's put in snakes, and he's developed the whole idea. So all I'm really trying to show is there's a kernel of an idea going far back, but our man has, as it were, given it a completely new arrangement. And again, his ingenuity comes to the fore. He repeated the same idea at Clonmacnoise, but Clonmacnoise, the cross is much smaller. He only had room for 2 heads in this case, and there's only 1 snake surrounding them all. But as I say, it's something very distinctive to the Muridac master. Another aspect of his work which is intriguing is animals, and there's quite a fair number of creatures of one sort and another, particularly cats, which feature in his work. Cats, very important in the early Middle Ages, particularly in your grain stalls. They kept the mice and the rats at bay, and a good ratter was worth quite a bit of money in early medieval Ireland. So one mustn't decry cats, but here you see he's carved it very well. Can you see the way the tail is curving around the body of the little cat up above? It's very unclear what the cat is actually doing. He's sort of, I don't know whether he's got some prey of some sort, but it's hard to make out exactly what it is. And here are more examples down below. These are the 2 famous cats at Monaster Boyce, the ones that are at the base where the inscription is. The M for Muridac is there right between the 2 of them, and the 2 kneeling cats with the tail as always coming right around and through their back legs are there. And in both cases, they've got prey in their claws. It looks suspiciously like some sort of bird perhaps, or maybe it's a 4-legged creature with the cat on the left. And then there's a sense of, I'm going to say, humor or witticisms in his work. And that's the best known example of that, of course, famous in Irish art really, are the 2 beard pullers at the foot of the cross at Monaster Boyce, of Muridac's cross. You can see there a man's favourite type of male head with the beard and a 3/4 view. And they're long beards, each one, or the opposite one is pulling hard on the beards. And you can imagine this is on a Christian cross. So people have tried very hard. What is this doing here? What is the meaning of something like this on a Christian cross? And I can tell you there've been all sorts of sort of esoteric and erudite ideas trying to explain why and how this might somehow fit into Christian teaching. But unfortunately, scholars tend to be rather resistant to humor. I suppose if you're I don't know, an earnest PhD student trying to prove something, it doesn't sound very good if you just say it's witty. You know, you've got to come up with some perhaps more serious meaning. And my view is, I think we should read it for what it is. Really, it's a kind of semi-humorous little vignette there, and there are times when I think we forget that, you know, life in a monastery, which of course Monaster Boyce was, wasn't perhaps just the extremely severe life that we tend to imagine. I mean, we don't think of medieval monasteries as bundles of fun, but it's quite clear that humour played a big part, and we know this from lots of little word games that were played in we see them in the manuscripts of the day. So, but amongst the meanings that you know, have been given, long beards are often associated with wisdom. And of course, it's hard not to forget that there was a famous incident in Irish history recorded by Gerald of Wales in 1185, of course, long after the cross was carved. But that was when Prince John, the future King John, came to Ireland, and there was apparently a notorious incident in which he pulled the beards of Irish kings, which of course was not the done thing to do, and not diplomatically a very sensible thing to do. But clearly beards and you know, the appreciation of beards probably mattered in early Irish society in ways that we can't fully understand. Anyway, back to that question I raised a little while ago, was the sculptor Irish? Well, yes, absolutely certain. I think he's most definitely Irish, because although his figure style is very naturalizing in its form, and very different from the sort of thing, as I've mentioned, we find in the Book of Kells, we nonetheless find a lot of overlapping themes and tricks. The beard pulling, of course, we've several examples of that in the Book of Kells. And in a way, this illustrates clearly what I've been saying, that flat, wonderfully linear style and complex style of the Book of Kells, and a much more full naturalizing style of the Muridat Master, but the same theme. And then we even get little stylistic tricks, like you see here on the right. That's an angel, and notice on the shoulder blade of the angel, you get a spiral, a circular form. And we find that in the Book of Kells, all over the Book of Kells, of course. And I just have a detail there from the page which shows the evangelist John, and you can see the same little trick is used on there on the knee. So I have no doubt that the background of this sculptor, not just simply his style of carving, but far more than that, many of his themes and ideas are firmly implanted in Irish art and culture of the late 9th, early 10th century. Now, when it comes to oh yes, here's one other detail. I'd forgotten to mention this one. And I think this is quite telling. This is very interesting, in fact, because if you look on the right, you can see that this is a scene from Muridat's Cross, and you can see it's Cain who's killing Abel. As you can see, he supposedly killed Cain with the jawbone of an ass. Though that looks more like a big spade that he's tonking him with there. But it's the hemline down below I wanted you to notice. And notice Cain's hemline goes up and down over his thighs. Now, that's a device which the painters used. And it was a way in two-dimensional art where you can see it in the Book of Kells here. I don't know whether you can guess where this is from, of course. The feet up above will tell you it's the famous picture on folio 7 of the Virgin Mary. But you can see the way he's drawn the lines, the hemline up and around the feet there of the Virgin Mary. And of course, that's been adopted almost without thinking by the sculptors. But of course, as it's three-dimensional in the sculpture, they don't really need to do that because they've got the depth in the stone anyway. They don't need to give the illusion of depth, which of course the artists, or the painters rather, have to do themselves. But the imagination, I think, of the sculptor really comes to the fore in the great scene of the Last Judgment, which we get on Muridat's Cross here at Monaster Boyce. And you can see the judging Christ right in the center, standing a little bit flat-footed, a bit precariously too on a little ledge, holding a cross and also a flowering rod with a bird up immediately above him, virtually on his head. To the left, as we look, we've probably got David playing his harp with a bird perched on the top of the harp. And then we've got, to the right, we've got a piper playing three-pipe, I think it's a three-piped instrument there. And you can't perhaps see this very clearly, but between the harp and Christ himself, you can see a little rectangle, a book, and that almost certainly is the Book of Life, which listed those who would be saved. And those who are going to be saved are on the left as we look. Those, the damned heading for hell, are on the right. And of course, judgment meant that the soul would be weighed, and down below, and you can see this very clearly, is the weighing of the souls. There is the Archangel St. Michael. And I think I've got a detail of this, hope I have, there it is. And the sculptor, again, true to form, he's always interested in the details and how things work. So his weighing scales are very well done, and you can see he's even got all the kind of ironwork nicely laid out. And Michael is striding forward, and he's got a staff. It's actually a crozier, which he plunges in. You don't perhaps see it. I might go back to the previous picture there. You might see it more clearly there. He plunges into the head of a figure, a very spindly figure lying along the bottom. And you can see two very thin legs there over on the right, just in that area. And of course, you've got the weighing scales up above, and the soul is sitting there being weighed. But it's interesting how the staff or the crozier of Michael seems to go straight for the eye. And this sculptor is rather good, I think, whenever a devil or a demon is being overcome, it's straight into the eye. And that's an interesting thing to think about, the significance of that in terms of overcoming evil and misperceptions. But just to go on, because the imagination is shown particularly, not just, I think, in the weighing of the souls, but there's nothing like hell. Medieval sculptors, of course, they just, I won't say love depicting hell, but hell gave them plenty of scope. And you can see that here. And unless, first of all, to the extreme left, you can see somebody with a three-pronged fork there, prodding a demon, people into hell. But of course, unprecedented, not paralleled anywhere else as far as I know, a demon kicking people with great energy into hell. And there, of course, the damned, or over there on the right. And it's a brilliant little detail, but so typical, I feel, of this particular sculptor and the sort of ideas that he came up with. This, I should explain and stress, is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, full depiction of a Last Judgment in European art. And in the past, there's been a tendency always to say, well, he must have based it on some imported image or whatever. But I would be very keen on stressing the fact that, you know, we shouldn't underestimate the imagination, the ingenuity, even the originality of Irish artists at this stage. And we mustn't forget either that there have been 400 or 500 years of Christianity. So, you know, many, presumably, books and manuscripts with illustrations of one sort or another may have come into the country and may have served as models, but there's nothing that can really parallel these. They're very clearly elsewhere in Europe. Now, I've mentioned Muirdat's Cross at Monasterboice that gives the sculptor his name, and Clonmacnoise, but there's a third cross I want to talk about. It's also at Monasterboice. I call it the Tall Cross because it's the easiest way of remembering it. And as you can see, its proportions are quite different from Muirdat's Cross that we were looking at a moment ago. But what's interesting about this is that it clearly came after the other one, because I mentioned the formula. You have the Last Judgment on one side, crucifixion on the other. Well, they have to really repeat those. They certainly have to repeat the figure of the crucified Christ. But here on the Tall Cross, it's as if they've gone out of their way to try and vary the subject and not repeat them. So when we come to the east side, where you might expect the Last Judgment, they've gone for a very closely related subject, but they have chosen not to repeat what they've just done, presumably, or what the sculptor's just done a few years before on Muirdat's Cross. So what we've got here is the Second Coming, obviously an incident in Christian belief closely associated with the Last Judgment. And the idea was that Christ would appear to the world at the end of time as a great military leader. And that's effectively what we're seeing here in the center, with Christ as effectively a soldier with a shield and a sword, and surrounded by followers, again, who've all got circular shields. In, of course, the Irish fashion, as this is the form of shields that you know, exactly the form of shield which was found here. And he came in clouds of glory, so we're told, and so the clouds presumably down below on which he's standing. But the subject is interesting because, of course, the Second Coming reminds us of the Last Judgment, of the damned and the saved, and we get two images, in fact, of salvation. One up above, which shows the story of Christ walking on the water in the Sea of Galilee, and Peter trying to follow him, and then, as it were, beginning to drown. And there you can see, I think at the very top there, Christ rescuing Peter, or rather Peter being rescued, and you can see the boat and the oars. And down below we have an Old Testament story, again about salvation and saving. This is the story of 3 Hebrews in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, who refused to worship an idol, and for their pains they were flung into a furnace. And to the amazement of Nebuchadnezzar and his followers, they weren't burnt, they weren't consumed, and he could see them walking around inside the furnace, protected by an angel. And that's what you can see there, the angel with its wings, the 3 little figures at the bottom. But our sculptor has given it a rather strange emphasis, because he's put an awful lot of, or devoted a lot of his space to 2 soldiers and they are piling on the actual, well, it's the firewood for the fire up at the top. And that, again, very unusual, without any obvious parallels, whether that was a concoction of our own sculptor or adapted from something else, of course, we'll never really know. And the arms are brilliant too, because on the right you can see another damnation scene with two saints there with their croziers. The crozier was very much a sort of weapon for, you know, a Christian saint, a Christian believer. And here, bang, straight into the eye again of this figure heading dead straight down to earth, crashing his head against a rather nasty looking spike, in fact, when he gets there. And this is the story of the fall of Simon Magus. Simon, so the Gospels, or rather it's the epistles tell us, was a preacher who took issue with St. Peter and claimed that he could fly, and so he proceeded to fly, but Peter prayed to the Lord, and the next thing that happened was that Simon came crashing headlong to the ground, which is what we're seeing here. But a very characteristic little subject, which was always taken as an image of, you know, the dangers or the warnings really against false prophets, which is what Simon was. And on the left, on the other side, that looks like a figure in the grip of 2 nasty beasts. Again, very much reminding us, I suppose, of the torments of hell. And again, a warning against, or an invitation perhaps to believe steadfastly in the Christian truth. Now, as well as all these figure panels, our sculptor was also adept at some fabulous decorative schemes, abstract schemes. The interlace, of course, we're so familiar with from early Irish art. It's sometimes been said that, oh, well, probably assistants did this, but I don't believe that, because carving this stuff is pretty tricky. And you've got to get, the designs are very clever and sophisticated. And you'll notice here that they are, all 3 panels are quite different. And I don't think a master sculptor is going to leave, you know, some trainee just to get going on the interlace, because you have to get every little thread correct, otherwise it won't work. This photograph was taken about 7:30 on a summer's evening, and it's only then that the sun comes round on the north side. And this is where the 2, do you see down the bottom there, the 2 beard pullers are. But it's quite useful, the picture, because you can see that there are, can you see the figures which are projecting out, the figures around the side, and you show that it shows that the relief isn't just, the carvings aren't just cut back into the stone, they actually project forward from it to a certain degree as well. Now, I mentioned that you know, this stuff is tricky, and what's quite interesting is that the very same patterns were used by the sculptor on 1 or 2 of the other crosses. So you can match his work, not just in the figure style and the compositions, you can match them also in these abstract panels as well. And I said, you know, watch what you're doing when you're carving interlace. It's not that straightforward. And something went desperately wrong here. There is theories as to what went wrong, Had the master gone off for a few days, or was there some, more sophisticated explanation for this? This isn't any of the crosses I'm talking about. This is in, as you can see, at Kilkieran in County Kilkenny, but it's a kind of little warning. While I'm on this, I should mention that one thing which does worry me hugely now, in days of old, by which I mean about 20, 30 years ago, the crosses were always or regularly sprayed to get rid of organic growth of one sort or another. Now, for health reasons, that's now been stopped. And the state of play of that very same cross in Kilkieran, that's a picture I took at the bottom, just as you can see, just over a year and a half ago, compared with the ones I took in 1978. And, it's a huge issue, the conservation, the care of the crosses. Not so bad, of course, at Monaster Boyce, but lichen and the growth of lichen is, I see it as the great enemy, because of course it conceals the sculpture. But I'll get into trouble if I say that, because I know botanists think that lichen is just such a wonderful thing, it should be protected at all costs. I just wish that if it was going to grow, it would find somewhere else to grow rather than on the crosses. Anyway, that's digression. Now, one of the things about interlace is you can actually see how they're carved, because when you're doing the interlace, you had to drill out the holes between the threads, and you notice they're circular. And that almost means one thing: they're using a drill. And that's the sort of drill they were using. This is a later example, but it's known as the bow drill. I'm not going to try and explain how it worked, but I hope you can just see, if you look at the left, if you see that bar across, if you pull that bar up and down the vertical stem, it twists the main stem and provides you with a drill. And so there's a sculpture at work. This is in Renaissance Italy, but using the bow drill, which was certainly used here in Ireland. And of course, along with the chisels and the claw chisels, that's a sculptor who was working on actually a facsimile cross. And I'm afraid I sneaked a photograph of all his tools, but the tools that he was using just a few years ago, fundamentally are no different from the ones that were used in the Middle Ages. So that just brings me towards the very practical issues of how these things were made. And of course, you need the stone to start with. And it's very easy looking at something like Muridat's cross just to take it for granted. But I've outlined there in orange, that all the cross you see in orange came from one block of stone. And it's 4 meters high and probably a bit more originally. And that's a massive block of stone, a huge block of stone. And when it was pulled out of the quarry, it must have weighed probably upwards of 10 tons, maybe more. And years ago, when I was a student of art history in London, I remember we had lectures on sculpture, and one of the things we were always told to do was imagine the stone before the sculptor started to work. And then you can begin to see, well, how does he begin? What does he have to cut away? How does he do it? And it's a very useful little exercise to do. But that block, where did it come from? Well, it's always been something of a mystery, because, as the geologists insist, there is no stone of this type, this quartzy sandstone, in the immediate vicinity of Monaster Boyce. And thanks to advice I received from my geological colleagues in Trinity, it seems that by far the best bet for the origin of the stone is a place called Carrickleck, just outside King's Court in the north of County Meath. And there's an outcrop there of just this type of sandstone. And the quarry actually was in use until just a few years ago. Here it is. It's now partly water filled, as you can see. And the sort of long slabs of stone, and I should point out, actually, you want a piece of stone which is not only, 4 meters, well, what's that? That's 12, 14 feet long, but also it's got to be free of any flaws. It's also got to be quite deep, the bedding's got to be quite deep because the crosses are well, they're half a meter wide. So it's finding the right block of stone is not something that we should just assume was easy and take it for granted. So getting it to Monaster Boyce must have been in itself quite a major task. And another thing, which is, I think, fairly obvious, you would almost certainly rough out a stone at the quarry because you could halve the weight in that way. Obviously the block would be much lighter if you've already shaped it or partly shaped it. But Muradach's cross was one massive block of stone, but the second cross at Monaster Boyce was made in a slightly different way because, as you can see here, it's made of two, or actually, if you count the base and the capstone, 4 blocks of stone, but 2 major ones. And I marked arrows there where the joints are. Now, that is quite clever in a way because it means that you don't have to have nearly such a big block of stone, and you don't have to, it's a bit simpler to create in a way, except you've got to, how are you going to fit the top section, the ring, into the shaft? And just to show you, sorry, I've gone the wrong way there. Here we are, just to show you what I mean here. You've got the top, I've separated the two. That has to be dropped into a slot. And to do that, you would have to have a crane, which I reckon would be at least 30 feet high. And that begins to make you think about the scale of these monuments. And then obviously they were just dropped down into place. It remained a weakness, actually, that joint, and very few of the crosses made this way have actually survived intact. But back in the 1990s, the crosses at Clonmacnoise were all moved indoors. And this is what they had to do, the Office of Public Works had to do when they were shifting them, obviously wrapped it up and lifted the weight. But look at this, and that's a much smaller cross than the ones we're dealing with at Monaster Boyce. So that sent me off to the engineering department in Trinity College when thinking about all this. And that's where I got some advice about cranes and the history of cranes. And the most likely form of hoist that they would have used would have been the tripod, which the Romans used. And I think that's the most likely system they may have used, but they would have been these big tripod cranes on a fairly, as I say, on a fairly massive scale. So it's only when you think about these problems or these issues that you see the scale of what was going on. One kind of final technical thing that has always intrigued me was you've got to cut the ring. Now, cutting the ring, you've got to make deep holes into the stone. And the danger there is you're going to break off the curve unless you're very careful. And the other point is that once you start carving, you've got to imagine, I think, these crosses laid out on the ground. And once you start, you might draw out the shape. But once you start cutting the ring, do you go right through to the bottom? A big danger if you do that you might come out in the wrong place unless you carve absolutely exactly. And they did what a lot of tunnelers have done in more modern times. It's obvious from the picture you see on the right, they started on one side, they went halfway, then they turned it over and started carving from the other, because you see that roll has got a little bend in it halfway. And by doing it that way, if they didn't quite line up, nobody would really know. So it was worth, I think, thinking about all those practical problems, because that brings you to the final question, really, who commissioned them? The scale of what we're talking about is so huge and massive in the context of the day. And we know Muradach's cross, it was made for Muradach. It says a prayer for Muradach caused the cross to be made. So who was Muradach? Well, Muradach was a big shot, to put it mildly. Not only was he abbot of Monaster Boyce, but he was deputy abbot of Armagh, so a pluralist. But he was also high steward, whatever exactly that meant, the Southern New Deal. But that meant he clearly knew the king, the high king of the day, King Flan. And then it tells us he was chief counsel of all the men of Briga. That's, of course, the area around Monasterboice. So he's a very influential local official. And don't think we should think of him as just some self-effacing monk who spends all his time in church. I see him as a big administrator who's moving around the country. And so why would he want something like this made? Well, of course, you begin to think in terms of prestige, maybe a bit of human vanity to it as well. This is a map showing the main places where I think they're work by the Muirdac master. But, it's always been said that the crosses are, they're there to teach, ignorant folk who don't know much about the Christian faith. Well, to be honest, not very much medieval art has that intention. They might say it's there to educate, but so often, as in this case, some of the panels are very hard to see and they don't come in a very logical order. They're clearly aimed at erudite people who, I might say, almost kind of showing off. But it's, these are not preaching crosses really in the way that they've often been presented. They certainly, I'm sure, were important in the in the religious life of the time as places of prayer and contemplation. But I just want to add the human element. These men, Muirdac and the others who commissioned crosses, I think were very keen to extol the prestige of their own monasteries and abbeys, and maybe, if I dare say it, themselves. And this is very true, I think, at Clonmacnoise, where we have this panel at the base of one side, which shows two figures. One you can see there on the right is clearly a cleric, dressed in the form of a cleric. On the right, we've got a king. Notice the three-quarter face, the hair going down the back. He's got a dagger or sword in his belt. Or notice the hemline, incidentally, the favorite trick of our sculptor. And this has rightly always been interpreted as the foundation of Clonmacnoise by St. Kieran and King Dermot in 548. And it's interesting, therefore, that this is actually extolling the history of Clonmacnoise. And there's an inscription at Clonmacnoise which describes or mentions the High King himself, Flan, so he was clearly involved. And there's quite a political flavour to the carvings on the base. You've got these two chariots, and then up above you've got a line of horsemen. And we find that at other crosses, as here at Kells, where you've got a series of warriors, almost a battle with shields, and two figures advancing on the left with spears. So there's quite a, secular perhaps isn't quite the right word, but this is far more than just a pious monument. And I think we have to think of them too more in terms of great political monuments as well as being religious ones. It's as if the Christian cross is firmly planted on the power of the local, as it were, kings and the local aristocratic elite. I have just one point I wanted to finish with about this, is that for a long time it's been argued that all the subjects we find on the crosses, are pretty well all of them anyway, come from biblical subjects. Now, I don't believe that to be the case. And we've already seen one example there at Clonmacnoise, where it shows the founder of Clonmacnoise. They're celebrating the history of the monastery. But here's another. Now, this is not by our sculptor. You can see it's in a different style. It's a granite cross, actually. But it was quite a mystery, because you see a standing figure there with an axe. An axe over, again, some poor unfortunate lying flat across the bottom. And then up above, you see a square panel just to the right of the head, then a crozier, and then a bell. And there have been attempts to try and say, well, if you look at the Bible, what could this be? Maybe it's David overcoming Goliath. But the one thing you always have to do in medieval art is look at the clues, look at the attributes, as we would say. And the square is a book, you've got a crozier, and you've a bell. And one of the things that is constantly mentioned in early sources about Irish, in the context of Irish monasteries, the bell, the book, and the crozier. They were the insignia. They were the key, as it were, key elements that an abbot, or particularly a founding abbot, would be associated with him. So the chances are this is a founding abbot. But it's a funny thing for him to be doing, going along wielding an axe. Well, there, the interesting thing is, who actually founded here? This is Old Kilcullen. Well, it was not much known about him, but the founder was known as MacTall, as you can see there. And it's when you begin to say, hold on, tall, what does that mean in Irish? And it means axe or adze. So the founder, he was actually started off, I think, as a blacksmith. So it was, again, his attribute. So I like to think of Old Kilcullen. There he is, the depicted on the cross, Mac the axe, you might say, the founder of the monastery. And that finally set me thinking about the top scene there of Monaster Boyce. Again, it's not clear what this was. It's not very well preserved, as you can see, but you've got a saint or an ecclesiastic. Again, look, he's armed with his crozier, and he's there on the left, and he fires the crozier in on a bird on the bottom right. And then falling backwards, there's a long bearded figure who holds a spear. And it's tempting to see him as a king, or at least a major noble figure. And the saint, if that's holding a circular object, that's a flabellum. And flabella were used in the early church. They were basically fly swatters, because when you're conducting the mass, there would be a deacon there, perhaps holding a fly swatter to keep the flies away from the bread and the wine. And you can just about make out it has a cross on it. So I think this is a saint, and he's exorcising a demon or a devil, presumably from that king. It's, I think, a scene, some sort of miracle scene from the life of a saint. Now, where are we? We're at Monaster Boyce. What saint would be most likely to be depicted here? Well, it would be the founder, who was known as St. Bwyd. So my guess is that's a scene associated with the life and the history of St. Bwyd, about whom, sadly, we know virtually nothing. We don't actually have a life of him. But anyway, that's my best bet. So from all of this, I hope you get a sense that we're dealing with a very interesting character. The Irishness of the carving is not in doubt. And I hope I proved to you all that he deserves to be celebrated as one of Ireland's greatest craftsmen, or might say artists too. And if we only look hard at his work, we can find out so much more about him. And I would like, just on the basis of what we can see, I would like to think he was a lively, witty, observant man, full of imagination, and of course, a talented and exacting craftsman as well. So that's all I have to say. So if you've been listening, thank you very much.
Great. We have a few questions there that have come through. Roger, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Tom would just like to know, I think it was answered sort of before he got to answer it, but it just says here the significance of the two cats under the Mocking of Christ panel on Murdoch's cross.
Oh, yes. That's a bit tricky, because it's like all these animal carvings, you don't really know. And the strange thing about it is that the inscription goes around the cats. So it's as if the inscription was clearly added on afterwards, whereas you would have thought it would have been easier just to chop the cats off, have a nice plain panel and add the inscription. So that must mean that they valued the cats in some way. But and if they are cats rather than lions. But the cat itself, I mean, the lion, there's lots of Christian significance you can give to them, but cats not so easy. But the fact that they've got prey, are they, as it were, seizing? Is it overcoming some sort of disbelief or something of that sort? But to be honest, I should just hold up my hand and say I haven't a clue, really, on that. And it's hard to know how far we should go. Yeah.
And Marianne is wondering here, says she understood the beard pillars were a symbol of heresy in the church.
Well, I haven't heard that one. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how they would get that. I have heard there are interpretations of the beard pullers, which I wouldn't dream of explaining or even trying to explain to the friends of Chester Beatty, because they would be particularly not in the afternoon. But no, I hadn't heard that one or come across that one. But heresy, and now I wonder how you get heresy out of I have to admit ignorance.
She's also wondering if there's a Middle Eastern influence on the interlaced design.
Yeah. Now interlace is very, very interesting because first of all, of course, everybody says, oh, it's Celtic interlace. And as we all know, the Celts actually went into interlace at all. And interlace seems to develop in the Mediterranean world. And so you get it in much simpler forms in Roman art, quite extensively in Roman art, Roman mosaics. But it's only really in the late Roman and post-Roman period that interlace really seems to take off, particularly amongst the the peoples outside the immediate Roman Empire. So I don't think there's any direct link, but certainly it goes back to the Mediterranean world. And of course, it's particularly in Anglo-Saxon England and Ireland that you get this fantastic, degree in which, I mean, interlace is an amazing subject because so many of those patterns, they're very cleverly worked out, and there must be obviously geometrical patterns are worked out. We see it in the metalwork and so on, and it's taken to such an extraordinary level. Again, it's one of those things that we tend to take a bit for granted because we see so much of it. But I can tell you, if you try and do it yourself, it isn't that straightforward.
And just Keith is wondering, is there any assessment of how long the master took to carve one of the crosses?
Now that's really interesting. There's a chap who carved a sort of facsimile of the Clonmacnoise cross, and it's now in Oregon. And I think it took him 3 years, but I'm not sure that he was working on it all the time. I belong to a sort of group of medieval groupies now who go around looking at sculpture, Romanesque sculpture, and we were looking at a huge piece of sculpture, Romanesque sculpture. This is 12th century, a bit later, in France, and we counted every individual block of stone which went to make it all up, and I forget how many there were. There were about 20, I think, and we all came to the conclusion, actually, that sculptor could probably do that in not much more than a year, and one man working alone, and it's very consistent, taking that to the crosses, my guess is, well, I mean, I've worked on, a max of 3 years, but it might be less, because it depends on whether you work in the winter and whether you're working indoors and outdoors, and did they have, when they've got the block of stone to the site, do they erect some sort of great shed? And then there's huge issues about, imagine 6 tons, 5 or 6 tons of Muridat's cross. Okay, you've got it laid on the ground. Very hard to lay it on a bench because it would just crash straight through it. So if you've got it on the ground, you can carve the top face, but then you've got to turn it over. So that'll be a big operation. And so by the time you've turned it over a few times, clearly you're going to have a workforce who can come to help you there. But I think because you'll be working along one surface, at a time, quite awkward for more than one person. to work, because you'd be, chipping away and bits would be flying into your neighbor. Probably you might get two, but so if you work on that basis, if you say 3 years, I bet that's not that far off. So, I reckon there might be as many as 7 crosses he's involved in. And I know 1 or 2 people have said to me, oh, that's a bit far-fetched, but then that's only 20 odd years. And if you have a lifetime of 30, and then particularly when something like the cross of Monaster Boyce was unveiled, I mean, it was just so fantastic compared with anything else. All these big shots, abbots, kings, they would want a cut of the action and say, well, we want one of them. And, you could see how a sculptor might get into very high demand. Do you see what I mean? And so might find himself, as it were, occupied by this over a decade or two. But I mean, that's an ongoing issue, really, trying to decide just how much of it belongs to one man and how much to another. One thing I didn't mention at all, of course, is that they were painted. And we forget the paint.
That actually brings me to one of our questions. So Cathal is wondering if they were originally painted to highlight the details.
Yeah, I think the sculpture is just made for highlighting those details. You can just see that brooch on Christ's robe, you'd just be dying to paint that. And then that sets you thinking, because, these are big areas of paint, and the pigments and the cost of pigments and all that. So it's perhaps less likely that they would have been, as it were, coloured throughout. And certainly in slightly later times, when we get more surviving, you tend to find there's a sort of off-white, and then details are all picked out from that. But we can be pretty sure they were painted for a very simple reason, is that crosses and sculpture in Anglo-Saxon England at the same time were definitely painted, because some of those crosses, they found the pigment on them, and it goes back to before the Norman conquest. And that's because some of the crosses were demolished soon after the Norman invasion, and the stone was used and built in the fabric of new churches and cathedrals. And so when they pulled them out and found them there, because they've been encased for 700-800 years, so they've actually found the pigment intact. Now, if they've got crosses which were painted in Anglo-Saxon England, anybody coming from England to Ireland would look at the Irish crosses and say, oh, how boring. Yours are all just plain stone. And of course, sculpture throughout the Middle Ages was usually painted. But there's 1 or 2 groups of people who are looking at it from a kind of very high-tech point of view and experimenting with colours. And now, of course, the great thing is you don't really need to do, have facsimiles and paint them all up, because there was a super exhibition in the British Museum a year or 2 back with Near Eastern sculptures, and they had a system of shining light in different ways onto the sculptures. So, for 2 minutes you could see it in colour as it might have been, and then you're back to the normal. So maybe in days to come, we might see that at Clonmacnoise or some other place. And of course, the great thing about that, it's non-intrusive. So if you figure you've got the whole system wrong, you can go away and change it. And, so it's an interesting area. But apart from just knowing they were painted, but that raises questions too, because you've got stone, you've got to have a ground, you've got to smooth it out. So there must be some sort of plaster base that was used. But yes, is the answer to the question, yeah.
And Jill is wondering, she says, any chance that your first panel figure was also a founding saint?
Which saint?
A founding saint?
Oh, a founding saint. Oh, hi, Jill. Yes. Well, yeah, why not? Could be St. Kieran himself. Yes. I don't think, well, there is just a possibility that there's a scene in the life of Kieran that it might relate to. But I'm certainly all for the fact, I mean, you know, throughout the Middle Ages, the monasteries, cathedrals, they were immensely proud of their founding saint. They had the relics, you know, obviously they were the places of pilgrimage, so that this is almost the first thing you would think about. So yeah, 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 very lightly is my answer to Jill.
And Grania is just wondering here, how can the lichen be removed environmentally? Did you get that?
Ah, I wish we knew, because you see, the I'm not quite sure how they did it in the spray. I never quite found out how but they were sprayed, and presumably they're considered a danger to people. So, but I suppose it's not beyond possibilities of doing it in a way that, you know, once you sprayed it, presumably it's not going to create any harm. I don't know. But what I discovered as soon as I opened my mouth about this is that there is a lichen group. And, you know, you mentioned lichen at your peril, because I was stupid enough to ask the zoologists in Trinity College, how do you get rid of lichen? Well, given that, well, not zoologists, botanists actually, but given that botanists, their main purpose, or one of their aims in life, is to keep plants alive. So I was saying, well, how do you kill them off? And they were horrified at the notion that I would be trying to get rid of lichen. And the argument has always been, well, the lichen will actually help to conserve the stone. I think that depends a little bit on the type of lichen, and there are literally hundreds of different types of lichen. And at certainly at Kilkieran, it's fairly thick, spongy stuff. Maybe it's not lichen itself, and I'm sure that's holding moisture against the stone, and it can't be a good thing. On the other hand, you know, why are we preserving these monuments? Because we want to look at them and want to look at the sculpture, admire the sculpture, see the history. So if they're all covered up in white, you know, they're not quite the thing that we all want to see. And you might say, you know, with a great painting, if you really want to preserve a painting terribly well from anything, you could probably give it a complete coating of something in black so we couldn't see it. It would preserve the painting underneath. Tough if you wanted to look at it. So, you know, it's a question of priorities. And I was told, and this was interesting, that the cross at Durrow, which for quite a while was brought, it was brought in order and put in a wooden chest for several years, actually, before they reassembled it in the nearby church, that the lot of the lichen had died in there. And so, you know, that gets you thinking about, well, you know, how if you deprive the lichen of light and air and God knows what else, will that kill it off? So that, you know, could you actually maybe during the winter cover the crosses up completely, or do something? Well, there'll be an outcry maybe of that. But I just would wish that there would be people who would take a bit more interest in this and say, well, look, let's try. And because there's no point in having fabulous, you know, tourist brochures saying, look at our wonderful crosses, and they go to Kilkieran and all they see is a pile of moss and lichen. And the dangers too are that local people then start trying to pull it off themselves and take the scrubbing brush out, which is, I'm sure, what was done in years gone by, which is yet another reason, of course, why we have no traces of paint.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
I was just wondering, do many of the crosses contain text inscriptions like the Mercuroc's cross?
No, there are a few with inscriptions, and the inscriptions are always mentioning people. So it's an abbot or something like that, or the king at King Flan. But that raises a really interesting point, because we look at some of these sculptures and we don't know what they are. So how did they know what they were in the Middle Ages, unless they got some sort of a guide? Now, you would find in quite a lot of medieval art, public art, and certainly on metalwork by the 12th century, if not before, you would have a panel of a subject and they would give you a few clues below. They would tell you what it was. And we have none of that on the crosses. Maybe you could have had painting, but there's no obvious room to paint an inscription. So that's why you feel that I mean, and it's something that people are looking at rightly much more now, is, we in the past, the subject was so much, of course, about what was the intention of the patron, the intention of the sculptor. But what you've got to ask yourself is, what did people who approached it, how would they have interpreted all this? And how would they know what was going on maybe 100 years later, if there was no key to what was going on? And there wasn't. So I think it shows that a lot of the subjects that we see there must have been very familiar to the local community, because they would instantly recognize them, which is why I think they did have much more painting than we allow now. And of course, at this time, it would be in the form of painted panels within the church. So we have to allow for that possibility. But again, it's another big question mark. We don't know. Just as well we don't know, because it raises all these interesting questions, which will keep academics in a job.
And finally, Cahill is just wondering what type of joint was used to fix the upper cross part to the shaft. It had to be very strong.
Well, it did, and they weren't. It's a mortise and tenon. So you've got, you put a hollow either at the top of the shaft or in the bottom of the crosshead, and then you'd have a projecting tenon. The tenons, I mean, I have measured them and I'm trying to remember, they're not that deep. You can see the same system in the bases. It's a bit clearer in the bases because there are bases around which have the cross has gone, so you can see the depth, and they're usually filled with water now, and they go down about a foot. But I think on the upper joint, it'd be more difficult for them to do that. One of the things that you see in 2 or 3 of the, and actually it's true in the tall cross at Monster Voice, you can see they've fallen. And what's snapped is, it won't be so much the tenon, it'll be the bit that's hollowed out. And it's only a few centimeters, the actual rim, if you can see what I'm talking about. And that's snapped. And what they then have done is they've chopped off the bit that's broken and created a new hole for the tenon to go in. And Donna Moore is a famous case of this, where the 2 bits of the cross don't fit together properly. You can see the sequences, the moldings and the subjects, they're sort of partly cut off, and they've lost about 2 feet of the cross. And I'm sure it's because it cracked. So that tenon, that mortise and tenon joint was, it gave them height and scale and all that. But, it was problematic really in the long term. You've only got to think, you see, it's the tall cross at Monster Voice is 20 feet high. And so that joint is about 50 feet. And if you think of the wind and everything working on that over 1,000 years, it's not surprising. And I suspect some of them fell in the Middle Ages. It's not more modern times necessarily. Yeah.
So that is all our questions that we have from people. I'd like to thank Roger for his time today and his knowledge that he shared with everyone. It was fantastic talk and very, very enjoyable. So thank you, Roger, for coming in to us today. I suppose a round of applause, but you can't hear it. So. And thank you so much